Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Network 2020 and UNCDF briefing on building resilience, innovative approaches to adapting to climate change. We will start, I guess we can get started now. People are jumping on. What we'll do today is I will give a brief introduction to Network 2020. And I will also turn this over to our colleague, David McHale at UNCDF for a little bit about their work and the partnership and an introduction to the panelists, and then we will launch into the conversation. So just a little bit about Network 2020. My name is Courtney Dogger, and I'm the president of Network 2020, which is an inclusive international organization. It's a nonprofit, and we're really working on bridging the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy worlds. And so we work with established and emerging and entrepreneurial leaders to drive innovative research and solutions to challenges that are critical to foreign policy. And honestly, I feel that nowhere is that piece of Network 2020's mission on highlighting and driving innovative research more apparent than when it comes to the furtherance of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Things like poverty, hunger, health, education, inequality. All are in some way affected by devastating climate events, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And these events are really happening with increased frequency and potency, and they're disproportionately affecting lesser developed countries, which the UNCDF works with. And it seems that critical protective infrastructure is often too expensive, and insurance premiums are often out of reach, or a part of a vicious cycle of destruction and rebuilding. And so that's why we're having this conversation today with people who are well-versed in insurance, among other things. And I know it's not always a sexy topic, but new approaches to insurance are really critical to getting ahead of the impacts of destructive climate events on countries. And so I'm so glad that we're having this conversation today with three excellent experts, as well as with our partner, the UNCDF. So I'm going to turn it over to David McHale at the UNCDF for a bit about their work and an introduction to the panelists.
Thank you, Courtney. I'm David McHale. I'm Communication Specialist for the United Nations Capital Development Fund. We are the flagship agency within the UN system for LDC finance as it relates to the world's 46 least developed countries. Those countries are, in fact, our primary sources of focus. We have a capital mandate and instruments that enable UNCDF to offer last mile finance models that unlock public and private resources, including capital, to reduce poverty, support local economic development, and accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals with an eye towards the 2030 deadline. And I just want to take a quick moment to thank Courtney and Network 2020. This is actually the second event that has been co-hosted by both of our organizations. And really the genesis behind this partnership is rooted in the understanding that the challenges in the way of SDG achievement are incredibly complex. Obviously, climate is at the top of the list. And because of that complexity, it's going to require a variety of stakeholders and a variety of areas of expertise, not just private and public sector, but drilling down even deeper in terms of innovative finance, municipal finance, policy, both on the legal side and on the regulatory side. And so we need to convene stakeholders from a wide array of areas in order to elevate great solutions. And so our work and also the audience and the network of Network 2020 just seemed like a natural fit in terms of bringing innovative solutions that can give us the opportunity to achieve the SDGs by the 2030, particularly in the areas where the SDG needs are greatest. So I'll leave it at that. So looking forward to a great presentation. I'm going to turn it back to Courtney to start with the introductions. And thank you, Courtney.
All right, thank you very much, David. So first we have Abhisheik Dhawan, who is the Sustainable Finance and Partnership Specialist at the UN Capital Development Fund. He has decades of experience in international markets and financial services, working with banks and technology companies in India and the US. And he's really shifting his focus to work on sustainable development. And he is one of the driving people behind one of the conversation that we're having today when it comes to new approaches to financing insurance for climate events. So you'll see the rest of his bio on the screen. He is clearly well positioned to have this conversation. And so our next panelist is Maria Rapin, and she is the CEO of Nephila Climate and a member of the Climate Advisory Board and Firm ESG Committee. She is responsible for the strategy and overseeing the investment process for their climate strategies, really to move towards scalable capital to support sustainable development. So she has worked on capital markets teams and has been working abroad for years. And our last but not least panelist is Michael McCord, who is the Principal and Managing Director at the MicroInsurance Centre in Milliman's Appleton, Wisconsin office. He is one of the world's leading experts in developing and managing microinsurance products, and he has worked worldwide in doing this. I've had the chance to read some of his articles and listen to podcasts, and he really has so many examples from the need for these kinds of products when working abroad in all different countries and all different parts of the world. So really brings some fascinating experience to this conversation. So with that, I just want to say thank you to the three of you for being here, and thank you to UNCDF for having this conversation, for working with us today on this. So let's start off by assessing the current situation with regard to climate change adaptation and resilience. In the world's least developed countries, there's a combination of challenges that include a lack of financing, a lack of infrastructure, and a disproportionate burden of the impacts of climate change. So Abhisheik, I'd like to start with you. Could you help us understand how what are the different challenges and how they create a unique climate risk for LDCs?
Sure. Thank you, Courtney, and it's a pleasure to be here with Maria and Michael. And you rightly started by talking about the biggest challenge for LDCs, and that is of lack of financing. So LDCs need financing for their own development. Now, as climate change happens, and LDCs have probably the least amount to do with climate change, but they are having the most amount of impact, and they have to deal with that impact, which means that it requires further financing in terms of emergency response, etc., when they are hit by a climate event. Now, when they have this lack of financing, they need additional financing for emergency response. If we were to ask them to protect themselves by buying a climate insurance, that requires further financing, and that becomes a challenge as well. So, and then when we talk about what products are available in the market, there are probably these annual climate insurance policies that are available. And as we know, if climate events happen over and over again, the premiums will start to go up further. So as it is, they have the lack of financing. Now, there is this uncertainty of financing as well, even if they decide to buy a climate insurance, because the premiums will change, and they will also have less certainty of the outflow from those policies as well to take care of it. And finally, if we were to talk to LDCs and say, why don't you build resiliency? They'll say, as it is, there is no infrastructure, we don't have financing for it, we are facing this challenge. And now if we had to build resiliency, that will need even more financing. So this becomes, for them, for LDC markets, it becomes a much bigger challenge to take care of or have the repercussion of climate change. So that is where this conversation sort of started. And I think Michael here was one of the first people I had this discussion with, where we started thinking about, is there a solution that is possible? How can we link these 3-4 different pieces together and find something out of it?
Thanks. So if I understand correctly, it sounds like it's basically a lot of money up front, one way or the other. Either you need to spend a lot of money on insurance premiums or on infrastructure, like mitigating infrastructure, money that they don't have. And especially in the case of insurance, there's not really that guaranteed return. There's a risk involved that the premiums go up and that what they get back isn't what they need. Is that correct?
That's right. I think there is a lot of uncertainty. There is lack of financing, and then there is this expectation to protect themselves by building more resiliency, which makes it more difficult for LDC markets, especially.
Okay, thank you. So when it comes to solutions, I think you all work on really innovative approaches to addressing these challenges that Abhisheik really laid out, namely by using insurance to cope with disasters and build resilience. Maria, could you talk to us a little bit about the perspective of insurance companies and how does one assess risk in a community and build a plan to address its needs?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So yeah, thank you to everybody for being here today and learning about a not very sexy but essential topic. And I think it is becoming sexier by the day as more people are thinking about climate change, climate resilience, and how we move into problem solving for it, as Abhisheik opened on. So when we are assessing the risk, we're working with counterparties or communities in different ways. So, in more developed markets, we might be working with corporations or directly with insurance companies covering homeowners. But as we look to more emerging markets, to Abhisheik's point about needing financing up front, typically you'll have someone like the UN or you'll have direct finance coming in from governments, or you'll have the government themselves participating in a scheme to maybe subsidize premiums to start to get the community used to insurance and what it can do. So taking away some of that initial risk. I think where we see, so far, I think that most of the developments have been to look at either how do you cover the actual losses taking place, or how do you put together some sort of parametric index that can based on measurement of some kind, get close enough to the type of losses that can have economic devastation to a country. And so we've seen different governments in different emerging markets who've used that technology and have had hurricanes or earthquakes devastate the country, and they do have those funds very quickly to help stave off those economic losses. I think, as Abhisheik pointed to, where we're looking next to evolve is because of Nephila's structure as we're really an asset manager who then uses our investors' funds to write insurance contracts. We're fortunate to be in a place to have lots of investors who do care about ESG and sustainable development goals and are looking to us to see what kind of future solutions we can put into place. Where's the opportunity in all of this? And Abhisheik talked about, if that resilience infrastructure is getting put into place, how are the underlying communities getting credit for that? Is that going into the risk analysis process and impacting how we think about their premium charges going forward? And so that's how we start, is basically looking at, I think so far most insurance policies tend to be annual, but how can we be more creative with our solutions and find more opportunities, and also think about how some of these communities have an opportunity in a way because they may not already be tied to certain types of energy or certain types of more emission-driven technology. Can we provide solutions that are getting them on the right track from the beginning and helping this transition?
Thanks. I'd like to just follow up with you quickly because you mentioned parametric approaches. Would you mind just elaborating on that a little bit? Because this is something that I recently came across, and just for the audience, and maybe everyone is very far ahead of me, but in case they're not, I think I found it very interesting. I think it'd be great just to hear a little bit more about what that is and why.
Yeah, sure. So the concept of insurance, like the very basic fundamental of insurance, is that you have to have skin in the game. So you have to purchase an insurance policy. You need to own the property that's going to be impacted by the loss. And so an insurance policy will cover the actual losses. So if you have a hurricane policy on your home in Florida and it blows away, insurance will pay whatever the damage was for that rebuilding. A parametric policy might say the government of Philippines is worried about a typhoon coming through and causing economic devastation, but it may not be actual property damage or property loss by underlying homeowners who are purchasing those policies. So you can put into place a measurement function that says if a typhoon of this wind speed or this strength comes through, we think it will have approximately this much economic devastation, and then the counterparty or government in this situation can choose to purchase protection for whatever category of storm they're concerned about.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. So Michael, I just wanted to turn a little bit to the benefits on the consumer side. So how, and especially in your very rich experience, how has climate insurance helped people in the communities that you've worked with or you've seen develop infrastructure and plan for changes in the future?
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be on this panel. Yeah, let me just follow up just a little bit on the index or parametric insurance. My focus, of course, is on the low-income people, and making sure that low-income people get included here. And there are lots of examples where index insurance has been very helpful because it's cheap to manage once it's set up. But it's important to recognize that because the trigger is simply how much wind or how much rain, that doesn't mean that everyone who has a problem has that problem resolved. And one of the things that we see often, like for example, in Jakarta, there was a flood product that was covering flood from a canal. And the problem is that by the time the trigger got met, low-income people were all devastated already. And so I think we really have to be thinking about what are the real issues for low-income people? How do we help them do this? And insurance isn't the only answer. It's only a piece of the answer. And I think we have to be very careful about that too. And this is why it's been so attractive to me to be looking at infrastructure and insurance combinations and longer term infrastructure and insurance combinations. So this has been really helpful, because low-income people, they live in the most dangerous places, the most risky places. They don't have money to be able to be in better places. If they had money, they'd have a lot less risk, right? But they have significant risk. If you look at Ahmedabad in India, right? There are people that live in the dry riverbeds, and every year there's monsoons, those riverbeds get flooded, their homes get destroyed, and they have these problems. We need bigger solutions that are infrastructural. And in terms of the low-income markets, I don't really see a lot of infrastructural change. Where we do, these things are big efforts, like in Belize, for example. Belize had Hurricane Hattie a number of years ago, and it wiped out people on the coastline. So they took those people and they moved them into the country, into the center of the country, to what has become known as Hattieville. Right. And so what's happened now is you've taken people who are traditionally fisher folk and you've moved them to a place that's safer for them, but they've lost all of their linkages, all of their business linkages, generations of skill sets they've lost. So we have to be thinking better about how we manage these transitions. And I think, insurance can help us on one level to get through some of this transitional piece. But we need to be looking at longer term programs that really help low-income people in particular. They're suffering not only from floods, but they're suffering health diseases. They're suffering from more insects and more problems there. Their livelihoods are being disrupted. This is a huge, huge problem, and it's felt mostly by the low-income people. And I think this is something that we really have to start focusing more on. I met a guy in Tajikistan who's a cotton farmer. And the cotton farmer, he relies on snow from the mountains to melt, fill up the reservoirs, and then he can use the water to grow his cotton. Cotton requires a certain temperature of soil, and it requires a certain number of degree days. The snow is melting much later now, as much as 3, even 4 weeks later. But the end point of his crop is not changing. So his growing season is squeezing. And he looks at me and he says, what do I do? We need to be thinking about these longer term issues and helping people to move through these changes. And this kind of approach is what's really important. We need much better, much more rational financing programs for governments. Governments are having a problem. They're not able to really do this effectively. You know, I was in Bangladesh a year or so ago, and I was leading a panel. And you know, one of the people there was a senior secretary in the Ministry of Finance. And when we started talking about climate change, he said, we need international governments to give us money. And it takes time, and it takes effort, and it takes focus. And I said to him up there in front of all those people, I don't know, sometimes anyway, I said, by the time all that money comes together, half of Bangladesh is going to be underwater. You've got to do things, start now with what you can start with, but we have to have a longer term vision, and there just aren't the structures out there to help us to be able to do that. And I think that's the important thing about what Abhisheik and the UNCDF are doing now, looking at how do we create these infrastructural systems. And my role, or part of my role, is to make sure that those systems are actually helping low-income people and not just wealthy people's assets. And so this is really important. And you know, I see this as really something that's very new, that we haven't really seen before, this kind of a longer term effort, this effort at infrastructure. And I'm really thrilled to be part of that, and really thrilled that Abhisheik is working on this, and the team. He has a huge team of people from everywhere. It's a great initiative. But this is what we need, is we need this kind of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Michael, and for all those examples. So staying on that solutions piece a little bit, you know, Abhisheik, turning back to you. I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is we need to be able to get ahead of events, right? And pair both the infrastructure with the insurance piece. So Abhisheik, could you talk a little bit about what that would look like in reality, like what the solution is that you see for the LDCs?
Sure. Thank you, Courtney, and thank you, Michael, for all those comments. So we don't have a final solution. We're trying to co-create a solution with the help of different sort of stakeholders who have different roles to play. So for example, there are insurance companies who have this challenge of pricing a 15-year or a 20-year insurance product, which will be a fixed price or a known price product for 15 years. How do they take care of the modeling risk? We've just started to sort of scratch the surface when it comes to modeling a 15-year insurance product. And then there are investors, on the other hand, who have made investments in infrastructure, but they don't have the models at their end to price for climate change risks. And what impact it would have on their portfolios, and how should they look at their IRRs, keeping in mind whether a municipality is putting together an infrastructure that is resilient or not, whether it is the planning process is taking into consideration the climate events that are expected in future or not. And then there are government agencies who are thinking about what role they have to play in order to move this forward, because we know now that while climate change mitigation is very, very important, we do know that we have moved beyond a certain point, and we do need to prepare for extreme climate events. We can slow down that process if we do enough on mitigation side, but we cannot just turn it back or not turn it back immediately. So I think the challenge is how can that climate insurance product link to what investors are thinking about? And then the municipality or the community that is buying an insurance or building an infrastructure can bring it together in itself. So one way to think about it is that if a municipality has put together its own plan for infrastructure, and then they also have figured out with the help of consultants or engineers, etc., what is needed for that community or that infrastructure project to become resilient, and they know that, then they can go to an insurance company and they can identify what is the saving in terms of climate insurance premium for their particular requirement, and how much will they save if they were to build resiliency, because resiliency, as I mentioned earlier, needs extra financing, and there is no incentive available to municipalities to build that resiliency, because as it is, they lack financing. So how do you kind of get them over that hurdle of building resiliency? So, but if there is an insurance product and there is a reduction in premium, that could act as a incentive to for municipalities or communities to build resiliency. And now if an investor is looking at that municipality compared to another municipality that is not considering these options, then they can price their return expectation and maybe they lower it down. So in overall, there is a possibility, and we don't know for sure at the moment because we're so far away from this kind of approach, is whether the reduction in the return expectation and the reduction in the premiums will justify building resiliency. But that's what we're trying to test. And hopefully this should work, but we don't know for sure. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. If I could just take this really fantastic idea and try to bring it to like a real world example, and Michael and Maria, I'd like to turn to you now. One thing that just came to mind is I think it was the back-to-back hurricanes and mudslides in Honduras last year. How could this marriage of infrastructure and insurance work in a situation like that? Or if that's not applicable, is there another situation that you could talk through so that we can get a good understanding of what this would look like in practice?
So, I guess I look at it in maybe two ways. There's like, what's the immediate problem right now and how much is it costing the government to hold funds aside in case something like that happens? Or I would say in many cases, maybe they just don't have it available and then they can't rebuild the right way. And so insurance is often seen as a cost only, but you're assuming that nothing's going to happen. But there's also a cost of holding that kind of rainy day fund aside. And so I think educating some of the governments that, by having this, there may be an upfront cost that you're paying now, but it's also, insurance is reducing the volatility. And so you have now a known cost, you're releasing those funds to be able to now think about how you invest them in resilience. And then the second piece is to say, okay, what's your plan? To Abhisheik's point, what's your plan? What are you putting into place? And so if you do nothing, your premiums may continue to rise over the course of the next 10 years by 10% a year, which when you compound that is huge. If you put something into place, are you going to be able to hold those premiums stable or potentially even reduce them at some point? And how's that risk profile, to use a technical word, going to evolve over time? But those are the two. I'm sure, Michael, you have lots of ideas on the topic too. But those are the two areas I would say is first, just looking what's in front of you. How do you release capital you've been holding aside? And then second, how do we look at it in the long term? And if you put that seawall into place or something else, how's that helping your premium situation in the long run?
Yeah, Maria, I agree with you. These are really financial discussions that municipalities and insurers and even bondholders are having. And one of the things that we found in microinsurance itself, providing specific products designed for low-income markets, is that we have to prove that there's a business case there. How does this make sense? And so I think you're spot on, Maria, when you say that we need to start understanding what are those costs that you're facing now when these things happen. what can we do that could be cheaper than that and yet more effective? And I think those are really important questions. And I think, you know, in some cases we're starting to kind of narrow some of this down. Some of the Philippines examples with typhoons and stuff, we're getting data. Some of these other places, we're getting some data that we can start to make these arguments around. And, you know, and I don't know what they are particularly to stop a landslide, what the tools are, but I think, you know, the understanding of what those tools are and what those costs might be then has to be looked at in terms of what are the other options. And I think there are always options, and one of those options is relocation. But relocation is actually a much more expensive endeavor, because it's not just pick up somebody and put them somewhere else. I mean, you have to work with them. There's retraining, there's reskilling, there's all kinds of additional issues that have to be addressed. But I think you have to look at these options and you have to really think about what are the costs of doing these in the right way. And so I wish I had some great examples for you of where we're actually seeing that. We have some things that we're doing. We're at the MicroInsurance Centre at Milliman. We're looking at what we're calling risk management 360. So where we've done insurance, and insurance is always a component of the work that we do, we're doing a lot of demand research and understanding clients. And by understanding clients, you can understand what some of the factors are that enhance the risks and make the insurance necessary. But if you think about it, no matter how good the insurance is or how appropriate it is for the market, if you think about that, people still don't want their crops to die. They don't want their animals to die. They don't want their husband to die, right? And so let's think about, even in the insurance context and over a longer term, let's think about what can we do to help mitigate some of these risks. So this is Abhisheik's work in a tiny microcosm, right? So we have a project in Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, right? And we have a milk cow mortality product, right? Your milk cow dies, you get some money to buy a new milk cow. But you buy a new milk cow, and then you still have to wait for it to get pregnant. You still have to wait for it to give birth, and then it starts to give you milk, right? Why don't we help keep the cow healthier? And maybe this isn't exactly climate change issues, but I think it fits. And so what we're doing is we're creating a system where they can get better veterinarian care, even by the phone, okay? And that's much cheaper for them, so there's an incentive for them to do those things. We're working on a system where they can get cheap or cheaper feeds, so they're getting more quality. And so this kind of a concept is what we need to be starting to think about on a broader range. And insurers have to be thinking about this, and this definitely reduces the cost of insurance. And you know, this example in particular is one. But again, we're talking kind of the tiny microcosm of this problem. This needs to be expanded out.
It's like the preventive care model sort of writ large, I guess. Great. Well, we are getting some questions in from the audience. And again, if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. So I'd like to start off. We have one person who is asking, does the financing for climate adaptation measures in LDCs come with any stipulations that the community or country must make climate improvements like lowering emissions or pollution? And would this apply in developing or developed countries too? Abhisheik, maybe I'll turn to you on that one from UNCDF.
Sure. I'm not sure if the financing that comes with targets, but most countries have mitigation targets in general, and I guess all countries which have signed up to the Paris Agreement have set their own goals, etc. So I think those are the countries which are eligible for financing. So if you want to call it that they are linked, yes, probably. But maybe not individual financing is not really tied to mitigation per se, in my understanding, but maybe there are other views.
Michael and Maria, have you seen that that there's any connection between mitigation measures or climate improvements alongside financing for climate adaptation measures?
Not necessarily specifically yet. I think it's coming more and more. What we have seen is that there, as I'm sure everyone here has seen, there's just a lot more emphasis on measurement of climate risk and then disclosure of that climate risk, particularly outside of the US. So what we've seen as now more people are starting to disclose their risk, they're wanting to figure out how to mitigate it, because if they don't have pressure with specific financing, you know, they may have investors who are coming at it from somewhere else, and that could include debt investors who are asking for what you're doing about it, because it's going to change the shape of the debt risk or credit risk.
Interesting. Thank you. We have, so the next question is someone who's asking, they have a question about natural disaster preparedness of those higher risk nations. So what specific measures can be taken in the future to ensure that low income communities are prepared for natural disasters and climate change prior to these damaging events? Are there any other strategies that should be adopted apart from insurance?
I think certainly, I think, yes, we have to be, we have to do better at preparedness. And I think that's a lot of what this longer term approach is to be able to create the preparedness, to create the structures to mitigate those risks. I think we have to do more to stop the advancement of these problems of climate change. But I think, you know, you've got some interesting innovations now. Global Parametrics, a company that does parametric insurance, does number crunching and such, and works with organizations like Oxfam in the Philippines, for example. They've come up with a product that, although it's kind of immediate preparation, they have a product now where when there's a typhoon in the Philippines, they actually pay out, give or take 24 hours before the typhoon hits, to allow people to get out of there, to have the money to get a bus, to do something to protect their homes better. And I think this is a really important advancement. And so this helps them in the immediacy, and it reduces the risk, and it reduces the impact of the event. So I think, you know, we need to be thinking more. I think we need to be, you know, in places like the US and Florida, right? Where we have hurricanes frequently. It seems to me that there should be some disincentive, some major disincentive to be just rebuilding again. I think Maria maybe mentioned about the cycle of just rebuilding, or maybe that was you, Courtney, sorry. And, you know, I think, you know, insurance has an important role there. I mean, as the price goes up, then you can't do that anymore. But that's not something that we can see in these other countries, is, you know, the role of insurance as a control mechanism over some of these decisions. And I think, you know, I'd like to see it take on more of a role where it can. But you know, people in my markets, the low income markets, they're just not going to buy it if it's too expensive. It's not going to stop them. And so, yes, I think preparedness is critically important. We need to move, and this is all part of risk management 360, right? Is let's think about how we can get ready so that we have protection for people when these events come.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And that's a really interesting point about the Philippines too. I sort of, you know, just to liken it to a term that we've all become accustomed to, but I think, you know, that idea of almost flattening the curve of whatever the impact could be. It sounds like that, you know, being able to get ahead helps one do that.
Yeah.
So let's see, I'm just going to go into the Q&A box again. Someone wants to know, how do you incentivize, financially or otherwise, people to care about addressing climate change now rather than later? And how do you evaluate these protective measures once they are put into practice? Let's see. Maria, are you is that something you feel comfortable taking on?
Sure. Well, I mean, you know, Michael raised, I think in more developed markets like price is an easy way. That's a function of the insurance market, is it's more expensive and people respond when something's more expensive. And we are seeing that that's causing action in the US and coastal states. They're thinking more about how do they want to promote resilient programs to retrofit homes on the coast. Or people are just saying my premiums are too expensive and they're opting to move somewhere else. You don't have that option necessarily in the LDCs, to Michael's point. And that's where it gets to be, I think, a little bit of a trickier scenario, obviously. But absolutely, from an insurance risk analysis perspective, when you're quantifying what is the risk and you're putting a price on it, when some of those measures of resilience are coming into place, that changes the underlying risk of what you're pricing. And so that will come down in the premiums. I think where we've seen markets that have come and adapted the use of insurance, again, to remove that volatility so they can be around in the subsequent years, has been like in India. There's a crop program, but that was really subsidized by the government. The government's subsidizing those premiums so that the smallholder farmers get used to purchasing that insurance and see over a period the impact of having that in place. And so the government benefits because a huge portion of GDP is coming from agriculture, and thinking about food security as well. But also, I think the farmers, without having to shell out too much out of pocket, begin to realize, oh, I see how this works. It's becoming more concrete to me. And so that's where I think organizations like the UNCDF and other global multilateral organizations have a role to play in helping governments kind of get over that hump and think about how they can plan and put these types of schemes into place. So
it's a way of almost taking the risk out of mindset change in a way. That's a really interesting program. We have a question. Someone's asking about who will pay for these kinds of programs. So where does the money come from? Abhisheik, is that something that you could talk about? These are one as I think about getting ahead and being able to provide the infrastructure and the insurance, but where does the money come from for this?
Sure, and I think that's a very, very good question. So there are two ways to look at where the money comes from. So one is that if the municipalities or communities, so think about it, that if there was a hurricane in any market, whether it's here in New York City or anywhere in the world, the governments will have to respond to it. So they need that money, whether they get it from their own taxes or revenues or budgets, they need that money, right? So part of the money will come from the budget. Not all of it, but part of it. The second is that if the investment is anyways going to happen in their infrastructure or projects or buildings or what have you, the delta of resiliency measure, the increase in the cost of that infrastructure is probably not 100%, it's probably lesser, right? So the private sector investors who are investing in that infrastructure will be probably willing to pay because in a way, their investments are also getting protected because of the resiliency measure. And so the investors, both public and private, would be incentivized to put in that financing. And yes, there will be an additional cost. And that's why the point about if you build in the resiliency, it brings down the premium, but it also brings down the return expectations, which means that the interest outlay for the government to do that financing would be hopefully lower if we start pricing climate risk better, both on the investor side and on the insurance side.
So it sounds like it requires both municipal financing, which they would have to do anyway, even though it's sort of a crapshoot as to whether or when some sort of event would happen. But given the frequency, things seem to be happening at an increasing rate. And on the investor side, would they pay for these additional kind of infrastructure measures that might help mitigate the cost in the long run, and then also bring down insurance premiums? Does that Does that
No,
capture most of it?
That's absolutely right. Like if you think about any community, they will have to respond to a climate event and they will need financing for it. However, if they adopt this approach, the insurance will actually pay for that climate event if that were to happen. But they definitely will have to put in some upfront costs in order to have that advantage. And in one way or the other, it has to, or part of it has to come from their own budgets or the taxes, if you will, for the community in general. So I think that's a broader question about budgeting for disasters in general. To Maria's earlier point, they need that funds someplace somehow to respond to it. And if they're using it better by doing something like this, then they are better prepared, and probably hopefully the cost will be lower than otherwise.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question, and this, Michael, goes to one of your earlier points about relocation. Like you just can't do relocation and it can be expensive and hard. Someone's asking about some Pacific Islanders from Guam or Samoa have moved or fled to Arkansas, and sort of how has that worked out? And so just trying to put that question in the larger context of what you mentioned earlier. If you could just speak a little bit about, yes, there are adaptation measures in place, but then there's also the relocation measures. And so who's doing that? How do you make the decisions around whether to adapt or relocate? And, you know, what, when it comes to relocation, if you could dig into what some of those pieces are and, you know, what the outlook is for that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know about the Pacific Islanders in Arkansas though. You know, what happens, we have to think about what is the trigger that makes it so that someone should actually leave. We used to have events that were 1 in 10, 1 in 20 year events. Now they're 1 in 5, even 1 in 3 year events. And even low income people can't just keep rebuilding. And so, you know, there's a point at which you have to start to think about what kind of options there are. And insurance isn't the answer to keep them where they are and keep repaying for their lost homes, lost goods, lost inventory. And so, you know, I think this is important when the issue is that there's not going to be a good resolution over time. I don't think there should be forcible movement of people. There should be options for people to move. And I think we have to be very careful because in the places where people live, especially low-income people, they've lived in these places a long time. This is where all their social network is. It's often where their family network is. Okay, it's where their market network is. I mean, you go to the markets and you see people there that have been there for sometimes generations, you know, selling these products, and they have people who come to them because that's their customer. That's what they tell me, right? And so, you know, once you move people out, then this becomes a real problem because they've lost their customer, they've lost their markets. There have to be issues around when you have a particular area that's at risk. You need to be able to move those in some way so that some of those linkages can be retained. The market linkages are really difficult to maintain because it's not those people living there necessarily who are the clients. There has to be some education, there has to be some reskilling, and this has to happen before people move. Before you move people, like those people in Hattieville, you know, they didn't know how to be farmers. You just plop them down somewhere else. So so there's education, there's skill-based training, there's options that have to happen in terms of shifting people. There's cultural issues to be concerned with. This is actually a huge issue in shifting people, and I think these things have to be taken care of. And I know, you know, I don't know again about the Pacific Islanders, but I know there are other groups like the Somalis and others up in the central north Midwest, where I am. And I know that there are church groups and government programs and other things that really help people to get integrated into a new area. And I think all these things have to be considered. You can't just pick up people and move them, or you can't just keep providing them insurance to stay where they are when we know that that's not a sustainable response. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, no, it is. Thank you. Thank you for broadening the lens on that. Someone is asking, is this insurance concept regularly used in developing and developed countries as well? I understand the undue challenges that lesser developed countries face, but it seems to me like this solution could be used in all countries, and wealthier countries could offset some of the costs in more vulnerable places.
So from a pure kind of portfolio management perspective, I would say that is happening naturally, because you have, you know, like Florida has these huge high value properties that have to purchase hurricane insurance. It's compulsory. So there is giant demand for hurricane insurance in the coastal US region because you have high value properties plus exposure to hurricane. And because there's more demand than anywhere else in the world in that region, that also means the premiums are the highest there. So when you are looking at building up a portfolio of risk, as an insurance company or an asset manager of insurance risk does, you know, you're also looking at how do you diversify your portfolio. And where it is now in some of these lower developed countries, there's not as much risk that's being covered there, which means naturally it's a diversifier. And just from an economic perspective, the premium cost is lower because it's adding more diversification.
So in some respects, in Florida, where you see, you know, houses being built on like, you know, just huge blocks of concrete, they're like, you know, seem impervious to anything with very high insurance costs, that combination can help finance solutions in lesser developed countries. Is that right?
Indirectly, yeah, because
Indirectly.
we might, you know, maybe the Florida property is going to have a 10% premium, and to balance, but you have 10 of those in your portfolio and you're looking for just one in some of the other regions that are more difficult to find. So you're going to charge a lower premium of maybe 2% because you don't have that. It's not concentrating your portfolio.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You know, Courtney, I think, you know, one of the important things to consider is that a lot of this work, especially in the developing countries, is being driven by reinsurers. The work of the insurers is driven by Swiss Re and others who actually have been very active in these markets. And typically what I'm seeing is between an 80 and a 90% ceding of the premium. So taking the total premium and putting 80 to 90% of that with the reinsurers. Mm-hmm. And so I think, you know, I think they've been both leveraging the money, but also leveraging the know-how. And I think they've been a very important driver of efforts that have happened so far. And yes, there has to be lots more here, but I think we really need to give the reinsurers some credit for the efforts that they've taken and their ability. They're able to do that because of their very wide diversification.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that addition. We have a question asking, how do you guarantee that the money gets into the right hands? It's good to talk about the issue, but you also need to deal with corruption. And so, you know, is that something, Michael, in particular, in your work around the world, have you seen issues of corruption when it comes to insurance and payouts getting into the right hands? And then just to add on to that, is this a place where a role for technology can also help?
Yes, this is definitely a role for technology. And yes, we have definitely seen corruption in a number of areas. You know, one of the moves that we're making, particularly in parametric or index insurance, is to move to a meso level where the government is actually the policyholder or an institution is the policyholder rather than the individuals. It makes it much easier to sell, to manage. But then the big question is, how do we make sure that it does get to these people? And I've lived in countries where, you know, the government has said, you know, oh, you people from there, you didn't vote for me, so you don't get anything. And really, I mean, this isn't a joke. I mean, that's what I see. And so, and I've seen institutions that have these meso-level policies. And I asked, so how do we make sure that low-income people are actually benefiting from this? And they said, oh, that's a good question. One of them came back to me and said, well, we'll have a 75-25 method. And so I said, well, okay, so what does that mean? And they said, well, 75% of the money will just go into our profits because, you know, we had to take the risk of getting the insurance. And then 25% will go to clients. And, you know, this is wrong for me. To me, that's wrong. And so the answer to the question is still to be defined. But this is a big question for me, is how do we make sure? And you know, I think, yeah, I'm sorry. I wish I had a good answer for you. I see it. I don't yet have a good solution to it.
Maybe can I come in with
Please, yeah.
very different thought. So thanks, Michael. So one way to think about it is that if the buyer of the insurance product, the insurance product itself is linked to building of the resiliency measure and its effectiveness, then that will probably automatically guarantee that the resiliency measure gets built. Otherwise, that reduction in premium that we talked about never happens. So I think that could be one way. It's not it's not a firm solution, but that could be one way to think about it, is that if you link these three different pieces and it's the same holder, they will either have to pay higher interest costs to investors, or their insurance premiums will never come down if the resiliency measures are not effective or implemented. So that could be one way this could also possibly solve that problem. I don't think it is that kind of a solution, but maybe.
Thank you. Thanks, Abhisheik, for that. So we're getting close to the hour. So I just wanted to wrap up and get your final thoughts. And one way that I'd like to do this last time with the UNCDF too, when we partnered on a briefing, is to talk about lessons learned on the flip side. So I think in part because the LDCs have often had a lot more experience or exposure to climate events and some of the catastrophes that come with that. What are some lessons learned? What are some takeaways that you wish those in the U.S. or in more developed countries would learn from the experience of LDCs? Who wants to go first?
I'm just going to say to appreciate what you have and the resources, we have at our disposal to basically, like, the responsibility that comes with privilege, to put it briefly.
You know, I think it's critical to understand the people that you're trying to address. And again, my focus is low-income people. It's important to understand them. It's important to include them in the decisions that get made, in the solutions that get made. That's the only way we're going to have success in doing these things. It's a little more work, but it's work that helps to make things better. And I think, you know, I also think that we need to be looking on the large scale also. How do we do big projects that that protect many, many people in ways that actually provide value and protection for them?
I think I'll kind of echo what Michael said. I think if we adopt a problem solution approach, whether it's in LDC markets or in developed markets for some of the bigger challenges, or which are more difficult, and then sort of kind of within the broader problem statement, if we narrow down to a sub problem statement, then try and find those solutions. But at scale, like Michael said, maybe we'll get there faster.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for having this conversation. I know that a lot of this concept and these notions are new, and you're working on them, and there needs to be data and whatnot to keep things moving. But I think, you know, it sounds like you're really onto something, and I hope that you really are able to flip the way that that the way protection is done, so that there are better solutions. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing. And I hope that those in the audience were able to get some good ideas from this too, because it really sounds like it's, it's an effort that goes beyond just the UN or just insurance companies. It really takes a lot of different kinds of people and institutions in order to make something like this work. So I hope you're able to achieve that. So thank you all for your time. Thank you, audience, for listening. Just a couple brief notes. Our next briefing is on geopolitics in the Arctic, and that's this Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern time. So we'll be talking a lot about, well, the other side of climate change. So what happens with big power competition when the ice starts to melt, or when the ice is melting up north. So we should have a really interesting conversation around that. So please do attend if you can. And again, just want to say thank you to all the panelists in the audience for joining today, and to UNCDF for your partnership.
Thank you, Courtney, and it's been a pleasure.
All right, thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.